Time is now 2 o'clock, and I will call this meeting of the Oklahoma City Deferred Compensation Board, February 21st, 2024, to order. Our first action item is item number 2. It's to approve the minutes from the November 28th, 2023 meeting. Got a motion and a second. And the motion passes. Item 3 on our agenda is items for consideration. Item A is going to be receive the quarterly performance report, and we have Kevin Moore from ACG here to present that for us.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's good to see everyone again. I'm Kevin Moore from Asset Consulting Group, and I'm joined by Jason Poulos from ACG. I wanted to just set the stage here, as we do have a couple of items that we're going to be talking through this afternoon. The first, as Matt alluded to, is the quarterly performance report, where we've put together a performance measurement detail around both of your nationwide and Mission Square plans, as well as putting together some market data surrounding that. So it's in a different look and feel than what you've seen historically, but it's meant to be one comprehensive document that covers all the participant balances across the plans, as well as the performance for each of those options.
I guess we'd interject. It's not different than what you've seen historically. It's the first time there's ever been one overall review that's not presented by the record keepers themselves, so of the multiple plans.
So just to give you a sense of what we're including in these quarter reports, we have a section here at the beginning that's a market overview piece. If you could start on page 8, please, where we just generally cover different asset classes and performance of those asset classes across different time frames. We're not going to dive as deep into that today because of the other agenda items that we're planning to cover. But just from a broad market standpoint, 2023 ended in a pretty solid place, where equity markets ended up double digits, the bond markets were generally up, and that was really driven by the performance at the end of the year. We saw strong rallies across asset classes, particularly in November and December, and that was mainly due to investors anticipating the Fed stopping their rate hiking cycle and then cutting rates this year. Now, what we've seen so far this year is that investors are starting to realize that they may have gotten a little bit ahead of themselves, and so performance has generally been flat and slightly negative in 2024. But where we ended last year was with the S&P 500 up over 26%, non-U.S. developed stocks up nearly 20%, small cap stocks up similarly almost 20% during that time frame. And so the way that the plans are currently structured is that there's options across a variety of different asset classes, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here. The next handful of pages just take those high-level comments and dive a lot deeper from a data standpoint into sectors, country performance, as well as different styles with growth and value in the different style indices. So we're going to fast forward through those and then ultimately get to the broader plan summary, which starts on page 20. So what we've shown here is just a comprehensive snapshot of the plans, the number of participants, and just as a clarification here, these are participants with balances in a particular plan. These are not unique participants per se. And then we have the market values rolled up across all of the plans. So at the end of December, there was a little bit more than $508 million across the Mission Square and the nationwide plans, with the number of participant balances being at a little bit more than 5,800. 3,800 was with Nationwide in their 457 plan, and then the remainder, or about 2,000 participant balances, were at Mission Square. So this is something that we're going to be tracking on an ongoing basis, providing updates at the end of each quarter, and so these numbers are going to change over the course of time. As it relates to page 21 and 22, these are all of the different equity fund options offered currently across Nationwide and Mission Square. You can see at the top there, under the Global Equity Funds header, there's 57 total options here across U.S., non-U.S., and global equity funds. What we're going to be talking about in the next piece is just the overarching theme that over time we're going to be looking to consolidate and make recommendations to consolidate this lineup to make it more digestible for participants, and trying to trim 57 down to, say, 10 to 15, just as an example. On the next page, we cover global fixed income, real assets, and then more balanced fund options that are currently in the plans. You can see under each of the headers, once again, there's 15 fixed income options, and that includes stable value funds, 3 real assets options, and then 12 asset allocation, balanced fund, target date fund options there. So similarly, over time, looking to make recommendations to trim this list from 15 fixed income funds down to, say, 3 or 4. Real assets trimmed from 3 down to 1. That's a little bit more comprehensive in nature. And then on the far right side, trimming everything down to 1 target date fund suite.
And we just all have to remember that this board was created recently to provide a governance structure to the 457 and 401A plans. And once that governance structure is in place, you all, as trustees on this board for these plans, have a fiduciary obligation to oversee the fiduciary soundness of what you're offering to participants for the city. You're not here in your individual capacity. You're here as fiduciaries for all of the participants. And in defined contribution plans, the responsibility of fiduciaries is to make sure that there is a diversified set of options for plan participants to choose from, which, you might say, well, more is better. That's creates a lot of confusion. And so the numbers that Kevin's using, 10 to 15 individual options, that provides a diversified set of options for participants to create a diversified portfolio. We're not talking about 10 options in large cap growth. We're talking about 10 options across equity that cover multiple buckets, as well as diversifying for fixed income. And then a default options for those participants that don't want to set their own asset allocation. That typically would be target retirement funds or stable value or something like that. That is appropriate. The second and important part of that is that those options that you're providing are the lowest fee share classes available in that option. And that's something that the next step as we go through this process we'll have to evaluate, making sure that the options on the platform are the lowest available share classes to ensure that you're exercising your fiduciary responsibility and best practice as trustees for a defined contribution plan.
Any questions on that before we move forward in the report a little bit further? Okay. On page 24, just want to highlight what we illustrate within a defined contribution quarterly report like this. So what you see here is one of the 401A money purchase plans at Mission Square. We have the total balance across the top, about $13.4 million for all of those participants that utilize this 401A plan. We break it out quarter over quarter so you can see the dollars and how they've maybe shifted from option to option, or how the plan has either risen or declined as markets have moved. And then we break it out by each underlying option to show you not only what options are available, but how they're being utilized by participants. And to Jason's point before about fiduciary soundness and oversight about the number of options that are available, if you just go down the actual allocation column on this page, you can see a lot of options have about 1.5% or less in them. So those are areas that we want to create some efficiencies within the fund offerings, just so we can trim areas of the underlying options available to cover more ground per option.
And it's not just amounts available. I think if my math is correct in looking at this list, 10 of those, the first 10 funds on there are large cap funds. It's unnecessary to have 10 large cap choices for participants. That's just creating some, what I'd call clutter, that just need to clean up a bit.
Yeah, so decluttering is certainly going to be a phase 2 once we get through the record-keeping provider review.
Kevin, just as a point of clarification, since this is, like you said, this is the first time that we've seen this particular report and analysis. So what you see here is really the detail behind, so let's say the 84 participants that were on the table on page 20 of the report. There are 84 participants with 13.4 million as the market value, and this is the breakdown of what those 84 participants are in currently as of 12/31.
That's correct.
Okay.
So page 26 just gets at the second 401A plan at Mission Square. This particular money purchase plan had nearly 42 million, that 41.788 as of the end of December. Similar breakdown here where you can review where the dollars are currently and where they were over the last couple quarters, just so you can see market movement and then also participant movement across the board. But similarly to Matt's point, this is 63 participants that make up this nearly 42 million on page 26 and 27. Page 28 just gets at the Mission Squares 457 plan. We have Deferred Compensation Plan 1 at the top. That's just to simply differentiate it from Nationwide's 457 plan. As of the end of December, there was nearly 150 million within this deferred comp plan, once again with the balances across all of the options listed on page 28 and 29. And similarly, there's a lot of options out there that have very small balances that we think could be streamlined.
And a lot of overlap among options.
And a lot of overlap as well. The next pages that we have here are simply the performance results for each of these options, and it's compared to each option's specific and relevant benchmark, as well as a relevant peer group. And we get a lot of this data from Morningstar, as you can see on the far right, you see an M-star rating. That's a Morningstar rating. We as investment advisors would be tracking and doing the due diligence on any options that are available, but this is just another metric that you can look at and review. For a Morningstar rating, 5 is the best, 1 is the worst. And we're typically looking for 3, 4s, and 5s consistently, just as a reference point. But here, as you go from page to page, it's going to go through every single option that's offered, its appropriate category from an investment standpoint, whether it's large cap growth, large cap value, small cap, non-US, emerging markets, et cetera. And then it's going to compare that to the benchmark that is the most relevant and the peer group. So
if you just stick with this and you roll back to page 30, you'll see here, just in this, with Mission Squared, you have 3 large cap value options. And then you have 5 core options, large cap core options, and 1, 2, 3 large cap growth options. Typically, what we would see is 1 passive, very low cost, passive core option, and perhaps a growth and value active option, 1 of each. not multiple. And that gives participants the opportunity to build a diversified set of options with those portfolios. And those are monitored, and the board is responsible for if there's organizational issues at those firms or performance issues, making changes and taking them in or out of the participant options. I know I got a question beforehand, and this isn't something that we're getting in today, but some plans will create a what's called a brokerage window for those participants that want to do their own thing, as opposed to just allowing the number of funds that the fiduciary is putting on the plan to just grow. So that's that's a plan provision that can be looked at later on. What we're really talking about now is just ultimately narrowing options down that are available for participants.
So if we could go to page 42, please. This is the nationwide side of things, where this is just the 457 plan. And as of the end of December, there was a little bit more than 303 million within this 457 plan. Same type of analysis that you see here, very similar setup as it relates to the number of options and some redundancies within categories. But when you look down these next couple pages, you'll ultimately see how things have moved from quarter to quarter as well. Starting on page 44, same type of performance calculations going on there across all the different categories. To Jason's point, there's going to be categories that have multiple options, so that's something that will be reviewed further on down the line. But when you go from page to page here, it's the same exact metrics where you have tickers if they're a mutual fund, what the expense ratio is, i.e. what are participants paying for that particular option, the Morningstar rating on the right, and then the rankings across each of these options, which ultimately categorize how well the fund is doing relative to peers. So a lot of different data that can be analyzed as part of this, but certainly all relevant data as it relates to a board and for fiduciary oversight.
Do you want to point out a couple of expense ratios?
Sure. So when we talk about the record-keeping provider review here shortly, we're going to be focusing on the record-keeping administrative aspect of it. And the potential for some fee savings there. But when you pick a record keeper and ultimately look at the lineup there, there's also going to be an opportunity to reduce some expense ratios for options that are offered. So if you look back at just to point out a couple here that we want to make sure that we highlight, page 44. Under U.S. Large Cap Core, see that BNY Mellon S&P 500 Index Fund, and you go over to the right-hand side and you see an expense ratio of 0.5%. That's 50 basis points, which for an S&P 500 Index Fund is relatively expensive. So that's the type of thing that we would be working with the board on, identifying opportunities and getting in the lowest share class available in order to cut down some of those expenses. And we think those opportunities are going to be across asset classes and pretty prevalent.
And those opportunities will be available regardless of who the record keeper is. Once narrowed down, we know there's going to be opportunities to lower, to identify and move into a lower share class, lower cost share class.
So any questions on the quarter report or the information that was presented or the format of it? Hopefully it was easy to follow along, at least what we're trying to illustrate through a report.
Today we're really just trying to introduce you to this report and not do a whole bunch of analysis of these underlying funds, because that's going to come later once we've narrowed down who the ultimate record keeper is.
Any questions for Jason or Kevin? Well, we do have an action item associated with this, so I'd entertain a motion to receive the quarterly performance report. Got a motion and a second. Cast your votes. And the motion passes. Next item on our agenda is item B, and this will be a presentation of the record keeper RFP responses.
Great, thank you. If we could start on page 5, just want to set the stage and provide the background here. So as the board knows, we issued an RFP to solicit responses from a handful of providers that are very capable of administering plans like what you have on the 401A and 457 side. So all of these candidates would be good choices for these plans, but ultimately the setup that you have currently with 2 record keepers we think is creating a lot of redundancies and adding additional costs. So we ultimately are going to recommend that you get down to 1 record keeper at the end of this process. Now, given how the plans are currently administered with Nationwide and Mission Square, there's been some longstanding relationships there, and we think they're both very capable of being the sole record keeper going forward. But since we went through this process and got a lot of answers and feedback from other providers, we think it makes sense to have additional conversations with not just your current providers, but also one additional provider that has a huge presence in the public space and that offers very competitive fees. The reason that we are recommending going from 2 record keepers down to 1 is really in the middle of the page there, where you see it's anticipated that consolidating the plan's administration could result in fee savings that are substantial. So that's where scale comes into play, and that's why we think getting down to 1 makes the most sense. And then after getting down to 1, we can do all of the work that we just spoke about with trimming the plan lineup, seeing some additional fee savings across options, and that can result in pretty meaningful fee savings on top of those numbers that are cited.
And I sound like a broken record. It's not just fee savings, it's fiduciary best practice. It eliminates confusion to participants as to, okay, there's 2 different platforms, which one do I pick? And then I've got all these funds to choose from. As fiduciaries, and from a best practice standpoint, you need to be thinking about narrowing choices, but providing good fund options at low cost for your participants.
So on this first page, I know we just kind of gave the outcome there a little bit, but wanted to just show how the fees are currently. And you can see here in this grid that the record-keeping fees are listed at 0, but they're really just getting administrative fees through a slightly different channel. And that's what we're showing on the far right there with those investment advisory revenue sharing fees. Down at the bottom, we have the total in basis points of 20.6 basis points. I want to be very clear about that number. That is based off of these fees that are currently being paid and the number of participants and the current balances across all plans. The fee proposals that we received from all 6 of the participating record keepers, including Nationwide and Mission Square, are offering a very different fee structure. It's per participant on a quarterly basis, and so the reason that we're showing it in basis points is to ultimately compare apples to apples as best we can. But once again, going from 2 record keepers down to 1 will cause that 20.6 basis points to be reduced significantly.
And why not have revenue sharing?
Revenue sharing creates an opaqueness around fees. You can't always fully understand what participants are paying, and today the best-in-class process is to have full fee transparency for participants. And so the proposals that we're going to look at here shortly are very representative of the current defined contribution space, and just how participants are understanding and seeing their fees. We think it's just a better model there. So the next few pages just outline the search process that we underwent. As we mentioned before, these are full service providers, and they're all capable of administering plans like what the city has. So there's not going to be any sort of firm or team issues that come to light from this review. But we did outline a number of different requirements that each record keeper had to adhere to and confirm as part of this process. Once we received the 6 responses back, we synthesized all the data to create some comparisons, and we'll go through that here shortly. But the respondents were the 2 current providers with Nationwide and Mission Square, and then 4 other providers with Bank of Oklahoma, Empower, One America, and Voya. Page 8 just shows where we are today. We're reviewing the candidates. If you could go back a couple pages, please. Sorry. This page. Looks like our page numbers aren't showing up. But where we are today is just reviewing these findings with the board and ultimately determining next steps and what that might look like. So we can talk more about what that next steps are upon completion of this review, but it may make sense to physically speak with a couple or a few of these providers that you would be interested in speaking with. On the candidate comparison pages here, once again, there's going to be no firm issues across the board. We know this space well, being at ACG and working with other defined contribution plans. We've worked with all of these providers in some capacity over the years. And so when you look at the analysis here, just want to point out a couple metrics here. These are all really large firms that cover the defined contribution space, and more specifically cover the public fund space pretty meaningfully. So when you look across some of these rows, you can see, Mission Square has about $63 billion in DC assets under administration. Nationwide, over $172 billion. And then you go down the line, you see very large numbers. They're all in the billions and billions. Down below, you can see the number of defined contribution plans serviced as a whole, and then you can see down to the public sector more specifically. So the percent of DC participants serviced is something that we like to ask only because we like to understand how much focus they put on the public space. And then more specifically, the number of public plans that are serviced. And you can see as you go across the row, all of these firms have a presence with public funds and have dealt with them for a very long time, close to 50 years or more than 50 years. The next page just talks about client service capabilities. Really the major takeaway here is that you're going to have a dedicated team that focuses solely on you, and it's not just going to be one person. It's going to be a handful of team members at each of these firms that are dedicated to you, that know your plan inside and out and serve in the various facets that are required for a detailed and sophisticated plan like what you have. The proposed team is outlined on this particular page, as well as their experience levels. We don't have any concern with any of the experience that was proposed to us, as we have talked to nearly all of these relationship managers already. The client turnover down at the bottom just simply shows how many plans have come under this team's purview and how many have left. There's nothing really that jumps out at us too much. There's a lot of turnover year to year, depending on what underlying segment that you may be in. But none of these are going to be deal breakers one way or the other. On the investment platform side, on the next page, really the overarching comment here is that all of these administrators have been in the business a long time, and they have extensive investment platforms. So we're not concerned by any means with trying to do due diligence on strategies that we like, or get certain share classes or investment vehicles available to be included in the plan. There's thousands and thousands of options that are out there.
So ultimately, we'll be able to go in and evaluate what's available and recommend what we think is the best option for large cap growth or small cap value. And that'll be available.
Exactly.
On any platform.
Exactly. So no issues there, nothing you can point to that causes any sort of concern on that front. As part of that phase 2, let's call it, we'll be looking at areas like target date funds. There's many outside target date fund providers that are available on these platforms, so it's not just proprietary funds, which is a very important point to make. So there's really an endless amount of possibilities there. On the next page, we just highlighted some conversion and security capabilities. On the security standpoint, multi-factor authentication is extremely important, as we all know, not just a simple login, but also getting a text. Sounds like some people may be familiar with that. It can be a little bit, yeah, it can be a little bit painful at times, but it's certainly good for something like this with defined contribution plan participants. At the top here, we highlighted just the conversion timeline. Depending on the administrator that you're working with, it can be anywhere from 2 to 4 months. And as part of this, with the hope of getting to one record keeper, there will be some sort of conversion process in place. So that's important to note. There's typically a little blackout period prior to the go live date of the transition, which just simply means that participants can't transact within their accounts for generally 3 to 5 business days, as an example. But that differs slightly from record keeper to record keeper.
And I think the next step, which would be interviewing a few of the candidates, that would be where we drill down on that. How does that look? What assistance in communication do you provide to participants? What assistance in education can you provide both virtually and on-site? And that, well, you'll have the opportunity to drill down on that.
And then lastly, just to talk about key communication and educational capabilities on page 14. Really, the statements can look however you would like for them to look. There's no real constraints there across record keepers. And then on top of that, participant statements are generally issued by the middle of the following month after quarter end. So no huge lag time there. And the education component, I want to highlight this because there's a wide range of education dates that are shown on this page. It's important to note that as we get further along in this process, this is an area that can be negotiated much further. So if you're hesitant to move forward with talking with a provider that may only have 4 or 5 days on there, just note that that is something that can move around quite a bit, depending on needs, particularly in year 1, as this large transition would be occurring. There's a lot of wiggle room there. So lastly, I want to touch on the fees on page 15. Now, there are a lot of numbers on this page. It's very busy, so I do want to just take a step back and explain why we laid this out the way that we did. So at the top, you see the initial fee schedules with a more open architecture plan design. What that means is that if you were to select this record keeper, this assumes that none of the underlying fund options are their own. It's all outside asset managers, all money managers that have no affiliation with this particular record keeper. So you look at the top here, as I mentioned before, these proposals that we got were charged by participant, and they would be deducted on a quarterly basis. This is an annual fee that we're showing here. Then we convert that to basis points based off of the roughly $500 million in assets and the number of participant balances that we reviewed in the quarter report. So based off of that, assuming that there's no in-house funds being utilized within the lineup, you can see the range of fees here comes in at a little bit under 3 basis points for Empower and goes up to about 8 basis points for Nationwide. So regardless of which one you would ultimately land on, if you were to pick one, it would decline from roughly 20.6 basis points down to these numbers. Now, taking that a step further, you can experience and realize even more fee savings if you were to utilize an in-house option in stable value or target date fund. The record keepers are much more willing to reduce their administrative fees if one of their proprietary products is used, particularly where there's a lot of assets in. It's just another way for them to get fees. So what we asked for in this RFP was to include a situation or a scenario where the stable value fund was used, your in-house stable value fund. And you can see just going down the columns, that's going to reduce those record-keeping fees pretty substantially.
And Kevin, was that based on the amount of assets currently in stable value across?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So based on the assets that are currently in stable value across the plans, the record keepers looked at this and came back with these bids. So you can see that just by utilizing an area of stable value, your fees can be down to 1.5 basis points, 3 basis points, and on the far right-hand side, 1 basis point.
And just, if I can clarify, when we say stable value funds, that's like money markets, or places basically for your cash, where it stays at $1?
It is,
Okay.
but a lot of participants in DC plans, they put their money there, and that's
Right.
where they leave
But I
it.
mean, that's what we're talking about, is
Yes.
the money market.
Yes.
So it's a little bit different from a money market
Or-
fund.
yeah, okay.
So a stable value fund is where a participant puts some of their balance in the stable value fund option. And the stable value fund is generally crediting a certain percentage back to the participant. And those rates are revisited at least annually, sometimes quarterly, depending on the specific product. But it's like a guaranteed income fund is probably the easiest way to put it.
Okay.
Once again, trimming from 20.6 basis points, reducing that down to potentially as low as 1. So pretty meaningful fee savings on the administrative side that can be realized, and then once again, not to sound like a broken record, but additional fee savings with the underlying options there. Down below, we just show a number of categories that are used across DC plans broadly, whether it's loans, distributions, managed accounts, or self-directed brokerage, which is what came up before. We're not recommending any of these features be added per se, but just wanted to include that just for data points as well.
So today was a massive data push to you all, an information push to you all. Like we said, the next step would really be for you all to interview. We think most importantly, just narrowing down options to one record keeper and then subsequently narrowing down fund options is critical. I think whatever the board desires or feels is most manageable in the next step of the process, it probably makes sense to have your 2 current record keepers in, because even regardless, there'll be disruption for somebody. So we can lower fees but limit disruption, continuing to consider those 2 we think makes sense. Not ultimately having both, but I think the next step probably having both and to discuss with you. And then we would suggest maybe one other of these, and just from the data to us, Voya stands out as the largest in the space, the potentially the lowest cost as another to consider.
Any comments or questions for Kevin or Jason on this?
Okay.
I
Just-
had a question. So is there any reason we wouldn't go with like the internal stable value fund option?
We think it would make sense to keep a stable value fund option, given how much utilization there is at this point, because that would create even more disruption than what is needed. We also think it's just an important feature to realize even more fee savings just by keeping that in place.
Okay, so
But-
like
but-
this middle row here would be the one that, as far as cost goes, that we would be looking at?
We think that makes the most sense, yes.
But as Kevin said, even looking at the top row, from where you are today.
Right.
Just narrowing it down to one, which is what we're trying, that's gonna lower participant cost, and from a fiduciary standpoint, that's what you wanna do. Whether it's an internally managed stable value, that probably will make sense, but that's the next step. And we think even nationwide, there's probably some room with them or to push on that fee with their internal stable value option, that might come down a little bit from what's here in the material.
Yeah,
That was the other thing I was gonna ask about was, with them being at 3, does it make sense for them, to have them in? But
yeah, it's an important point. There's certainly more negotiating room here versus what's on the page.
okay.
One question I wanted to ask, I'm assuming the participants in this are both active employees and retirees, that retirees leave their money in the funds, and I didn't know, just as a curiosity, at some point down the road, if we could kind of get that split of how many are active employees versus retiree, I think that might be worth knowing. And then there was one other thing, and I've forgotten what it was, so I'll think about it. And,
Active employees was right at 3,000.
Did you have
Was
that,
that-
Gina?
I believe the total across all the plans was 3,000.
yeah.
And it's also worth noting that there is some overlap, so we do have some employees that are in both the 401A and either the Mission Square or Nationwide 457 and vice versa. We've got a little bit of overlap in all of these.
The only other question I was just, and Jason, you mentioned it earlier, is just when we do have the whatever presentation, I would like to understand the communication plan and the implementation strategy as part of their presentation. Just going through an RFP with benefits, insurance, it's in our distributed workforce and our retirees, it's really important for us to be able to do that.
Right.
And I remember what the other question was. If somebody's 100% invested in, mutual funds and that kind of stuff, in terms of now having an annual fee, does that just get deducted from their contributions so that?
They're from their account.
What's that?
Just from their account quarterly.
Okay, but if they're 100% invested, do they sell something to basically generate the, whatever, $10 or whatever,
No, the record keeper will determine that upfront, their exact process for how they credit that account, but they're not forced to sell anything.
Okay. That's why I was just wondering if, in essence, if the contributions going in, a little bit gets shaved off, so to speak, to pay that fee before
Yeah,
it gets invested.
I believe that's exactly what happens across all of these, but I can't
Okay,
speak
sure.
to that with 100% certainty.
Okay.
And I did confirm with the city clerk and our municipal counselor that, so really, this is not the item that we're selecting. So that's our final, at a future meeting, so we to select the record keeper. This is really just to receive that to hear the presentation, and also just to determine if we're comfortable with moving forward with interviewing the 3, which would be the 2 current providers and Voya. So just want to make sure everyone on the board's clear about that.
How did we choose Voya? Out of us, I thought we were going to choose as Voya. I didn't know Voya was the one we had chosen to.
That's one I pointed out.
Okay.
Is based on their breadth in the public fund space, their size, and ultimately the cost that they're proposing. But it's the board's decision.
How did you come up with that? As an expert, why do you think they're better than Empower?
Yeah, so Voya's got a really large presence, to Jason's point, with public plans. We've worked with them alongside other public plans. The service has always been very good, participant experience and feedback has always been very good. We're very familiar with them. We're familiar with this team. We've worked alongside this team. So we think that the experience would be similar.
I had another question, I guess. So this self-directed brokerage stuff is my employees for the police department, it's something they're interested in. We've never had that option. And definitely if we're going to agree to narrow it down to just a few funds, I would like to entertain that is something that, speaking with my officers on a regular basis, that we would have that option. That's not something I would ever push somebody to. They'd really have to know what they're doing to go do it. But I don't want to limit them, because I can see a lot of feedback from my people are already going to be mad when they only can choose from so many funds because they don't quite understand the cost savings that y'all have explained. But I would like us to entertain that's the add-on feature that we can do, and ask those questions of how they manage those. From what I've done my own research when we got this packet, it looks to me like they partner with a Charles Schwab or Fidelity or somebody like that when they farm you out to go do your own self-brokerage.
That would be a plan provision that would have to be modified in the plan documents, so that's certainly something that I think a board, now that there is a board for these plans, would discuss, but that's not something that you need to decide today.
And all 6 did have a self-directed brokerage option. They have the ability to do that, and so either way we go. Yeah.
Correct.
Any other questions for Kevin or Jason? And so that is not an action item, so we can move forward to item number 4, comments from boards, staff, and citizens. Amy?
You're probably going to do it. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, a couple of things. One, Scott Pope is new on our board. This is his first meeting here representing police, and so we're glad to have you here, and even first meeting, given insight with that. So we appreciate to have you here, Scott.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this.
Would also like to point out some staffing changes. You may be aware that the city of Oklahoma City does have a new retirement system administrator. That's Gina Jordan. And so she is taking that over, has been on the clock since February 19th, so a couple of days in, which also leads me to my next point in thanking Mike Truitt and Mary Ellen for their help in getting ready for this meeting. There was a lot going on in that transition time, so I just really want to say we appreciate all the hard work that's done there, and to welcome Gina to the team. All right, if we have no other comments, we will be adjourned at 2:48 p.m.